Well, thanks very much for coming, everyone. Thank you for listening. If you're here live or listening to the recorded version, I want to talk to you today about macroeconomics and, in brackets, some corona economics as well. So my name's Dr. Alex Climo, as I say on this slide. I'm a lecturer here at the department. I've taught here since 2017. So this is my third year. I teach first year macroeconomics for the undergraduates and monetary economics for master's students. So what I want to do in this talk is I want to talk to you about macroeconomics, why it's interesting, a little bit about kind of things that I like to teach and how I like to think about macroeconomics, why I think it's a nice thing to learn and how it can change the way you think for the better. And then because we've got obviously the coronavirus issues going on at the moment, and a lot of those are creating some economic issues. I want to talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so it's going to be a bit of macro and a little bit of the coronavirus in this talk. So what is macro? Macroeconomics is a subset of economics, where economics is a discipline where we like to think about how people make decisions and how those decisions affect society. Okay, so notice I haven't talked here about money, about GDP, about growth or unemployment or anything like this. The definition of economics these days is so general. It's about how people make decisions and why they make the decisions they do, and then how that ends up crafting the society that we live in. So actually economics is really about how people respond to incentives and what people do. So it's such a broad church these days, we like to say, which is one of the reasons why it's such a nice thing to study, because there's many things you could end up learning about. So macroeconomics, which is broadly one half of economics, let's say, is about how all of our individual decisions add up to create these aggregate ideas, the recessions, bubbles in house prices and stocks, growth, inequality, all of these things, okay? So what do economists care about? Economists care about happiness, okay? And I cannot stress this enough. If you've done a bit of economics before, you might have heard this before. If not, I really want to stress to you, economics is about happiness and maximizing people's happiness. Economics is not about money. It's not about, if you ask an economist, what should we do? They're not going to tell you, we've got to make GDP as high as it is, whatever the cost, right? It's not just about studying money and inflation, okay? If you were to study something like, studying business, that's where you're learning how to run a firm, how to make money and good business practices and so on, okay? Economics is a slightly broader and different subject where we don't just care about sort of making money for a firm, we actually care about what's best for society, right? How do we maximize the happiness and welfare of everyone in the country or in the world, okay? More than that, economics is a way of thinking, right? How do we make the world better? Right? It changes the way that you think to realize that problems can be analyzed in a certain way. Kind of take a given problem and you'd apply an economic way of thinking to try and come up with an answer. Okay? And the two things that economists really stress when they're trying to tackle a problem is, firstly, being very upfront about the fact that we face constraints. Okay? That when you're trying to solve a problem, there's often not an ideal solution. Right? We have to realize that maybe there's a fixed amount of money in the bank and we've got to try and spread it about in the right way, right? There's no sort of free lunch, as we say. And sometimes you have to make difficult decisions and trade-offs, right? And trade off things that sometimes you don't want to trade off or don't even know how to trade off, okay? As a kind of prescient example, if you only had a fixed number of tests for the coronavirus, how would you split those amongst the population? Say today you've got 1,000 tests. Who do you test? Do you test nurses and doctors so that we know which ones of those are allowed to go back to work? Or do we test old age pensioners and vulnerable people so that we can identify them and maybe isolate them? Right? These are difficult questions, which are all about allocating resources when the amount of resources we have is limited. Okay. And the second big thing in how economists think about tackling problems is understanding that people respond to incentives. Okay, you can't ask people to do something, well you can, but they might not do what you ask. What they're going to do, they're going to act in their own, typically, their self-interest, right? and do what they think is best for them. And of course, self-interest can include things like they might actually care about society, they might care about the environment, right? But they're still acting based on what they care about. Again, a simple example, you can ask people to stay at home and do a lockdown, but if you don't have a police officer on every street corner, you can't enforce it properly. So you're relying on people, somehow doing it on their own. So you have to provide them the right incentives in order to behave and do these things, right? The classic issue is, if you want to raise taxes off people, they might work less, right? Because you're taking away money and making them work less hard. But there are so many situations and ideas that this applies to, that these are the two big things that economists think about when trying to tackle any problem. And the final thing that kind of makes economists and economics different, I think, is that we spend a lot of time trying to learn from history and data when we're trying to answer any problem. Okay, and actually at the end of this talk, I'm going to show you some data from 1918 and the Spanish flu epidemic, and how that informs what we should do today when trying to fight the coronavirus. So why learn macro? This slide serves as a sort of what I think is nice about macro and a couple of example questions, but it's also serving as the roadmap for the rest of this talk. So in particular, I'm going to first show you some useful tools that are macroeconomic tools, and secondly, come up with two example questions that we'll run through over the remainder of the talk. Okay, the two questions I want to talk about. Firstly, how do we measure poverty? How do we reduce poverty? How do we increase happiness in countries? And specifically, whether economic growth is good at reducing either poverty or happiness. And secondly, how on earth do we deal with this coronavirus? Okay, so the first things that I want to talk about are the tools. And the tools of macroeconomics and the tools of economics is some kind of mix of economic, political, and statistical, numerical literacy. It's about being able to read the newspaper and understand what you read, and then being able to look at numbers and understand the right way to use them and the context that they need to be put in, understanding the difference between correlation and causation. These are the bread and butter of being an economist. Okay, so as an example, I've just taken something from the internet from a website which you may or may not want to trust, called nationaldebtclocks.org. This website, unsurprisingly, is interested in showing you just how large the debt of many countries is, the national debt. So this is the United States, where apparently the national debt is something of the order of $20 trillion. And here they presented it with every comma, every digit, all the way down to the zero at the end, right? It looks rather large, doesn't it? And of course, that's what they want you to think, that this is a very large number. So as I say, the world is full of people trying to trick or manipulate you. And the question I want to ask is this number too large? But really the question I'm asking is, do you have the information at hand to tell me whether this number is too large? It's certainly large, but is it too large? And what I'm going to say is that you cannot tell me the answer to, is this number too large, if you cannot tell me right now, what is the GDP of the United States? What is the yearly production of the United States? Right? Because if it's a huge number, say that the US produces $200 trillion of goods, of GDP every year, then this 20 trillion debt is not that large, right? 10% of 1 year's production. They could pay it off in a month if they wanted to, right? But if US GDP was, 2 billion or 2 million, and that's what they produced every year, then this 20 trillion is a humongous mountain of debt from under which they will never be able to crawl, right? So clearly knowing how large the economy is important for then understanding whether this is a large or small amount of debt. So how large is the US economy? GDP in the US is around $20 trillion per year. Okay, so this debt of $20 trillion has to be shown against the size of the economy. So in particular, we can calculate what's called the debt to GDP ratio, which is 20 trillion debt divided by 20 trillion GDP, and we find that that's around 1, right? So about 100% debt to GDP ratio. So is that too large, right? Is having debt equal to 1 year worth of production, is that too much or too little? Now, finally, that's an answer that we can talk about, right? That's a question that we can talk about. 100% debt to GDP seems large, but what's the debt to GDP ratio of Japan? It's over 200. And Japan seems to be doing okay, so maybe 100 is fine. Or maybe there's something special about Japan that makes 200 percent debt to GDP sustainable that the US doesn't have, right? But we can't start getting into these questions until you get things out into the right units and understand, that websites that present humongous numbers, those numbers might not actually be that large in the end, right? Once you find out the right comparison. So that's the first thing, right? Just some basic economic and numerical literacy that's going to help you pass the world around you. The second tool that economics teaches is just to be skeptical, right? To be skeptical and understand that numbers can be used and abused, and you've got to be able to have the confidence to look into something and decide, is this correlation actually a causation, or is it just a spurious correlation? So I want to give an example. This is a coronavirus example. It's from a professor, Ben Ansell, a professor at Oxford. This is something that he's presented, and I'm going to sort of misrepresent his views here to show you how basically this can be taken out of context to imply something that's not true, right? Ben discusses all of this himself, so this is not a criticism of his work at all. It's just an example of how something can be taken out of context. So this graph, which Ben constructed, is showing you the correlation between areas and how much they voted for Remain or Leave in the Brexit referendum versus how much they are social distancing now during the coronavirus. Okay, where social distancing is measured as the percentage reduction in people going to work. And what he finds is that areas that voted more Brexit are doing less social distancing, right? So where social distancing means that they're still going to work more, okay? Whereas areas that voted Remain in the right-hand side of this graph, you see the line is lower, the correlation is going down, so then they are going to work much less. So take Edinburgh, 75% voted Remain in the referendum, and now people are going to work 80% less during coronavirus, so they're really staying at home, right? Whereas somewhere up here in Northeast Lincolnshire, 70% voted to leave in the Brexit referendum, and now only around 55% of them have stopped going to work. So this correlation could be misinterpreted, right? If I wanted to, I could try and spin a story that says Brexit voters are selfish and they're still going to work during the coronavirus, right? Even though we know that we should all be staying home. Remain voters are wonderful and they're all staying home now, okay? But is that the right argument to take? I mean, certainly to me, that seems like quite a stretch, right? So just looking at this correlation, you've got to be careful what sort of messages you want to draw from something like this, or that you want to be led down by anyone trying to present you with this information, okay? Because this correlation does not imply a causation, right? It's something we hear over and over again. Correlation does not equal causation. But, it's something that's all too easy to forget. And learning some statistics that you do in economics is a great way to really hammer that point home to make sure that you don't fall into these kind of traps. Because there's a much easier way to explain this data, right? Which could be, well, we know that areas which have lower income are more likely to vote for Brexit. And if you have low income jobs, you cannot work from home that easily. That's also something else that we know. So maybe this correlation is driven by the fact that low income areas voted Brexit and also have jobs where you cannot work from home, whereas high income areas like Edinburgh, they voted Remain, and you can work from home in a high income job, like a white collar job where you're able to, office job that you can just do at home over Zoom, okay? So this correlation might just be that. It's a correlation driven by a third factor, income, that we're not seeing. So this is telling us that we've got to be skeptical when looking at data, right? And that's something that you learn as an economist. And the third kind of tool is basically, I'm going to broadly define it as tools and lessons that we would use to try and make the world better. Okay, so this graph is showing us that the last 40 years have seen the largest decline in extreme poverty in history. Okay, it's quite an amazing achievement, but basically since the 1980s, even slightly before, we've had this massive decline in the fraction of people living in extreme poverty. This holds across all regions of the world. So the world is this darker line here, but we've got lots of regions. Inequality is going down. China and Southeast Asia in red. We've got South Asia in this sort of greenish color. Sub-Saharan Africa, sadly, coming down slower than other countries, where extreme poverty is being defined as the fraction of people living with less than $1.90 income per day. Okay, so at the same time that this has been going on, we've been seeing, obviously, a period of sustained economic growth, right? So the question, this naturally begs the question, is economic growth this kind of miracle driver of reductions in poverty? Does economic growth raise up incomes and pull the poorest out of poverty? Because if so, then this is some kind of miracle, right? Reducing poverty is a humongous achievement. But I also talked about on the last slide, correlation does not imply causation, right? So is this really something that capitalism did, or is this something that happened at the same time that capitalism happened? Right? On a similar note, does GDP really measure happiness, right? It seems to be that GDP is kind of pulling people out of poverty, but what about everyone else? Is it raising happiness for the average person? Well, this graph is plotting GDP per capita across countries against the average life satisfaction in that country. Life satisfaction is a set of questions asked to basically work out if you are, how happy you are on average. It goes between 0 and 10. And we see this striking positive correlation that holds across countries, and it's also within countries as well, that the richer you are, the happier you are, right? We're told that, you know, money doesn't buy you happiness. This graph is showing you that's not quite true. Actually, money does seem to buy you happiness. At least it's making you on average a little bit happier, right? So again, we're seeing GDP being correlated with happiness, suggesting that if we can encourage growth, if we can make stable, high-growing, fast-growing economies, we can make people happier. So this is an amazing thing, right? Again, it suggests some simple answers to some world problems, which is just get people richer and people will be happier and there'll be less poverty. But again, is this true, or is this some kind of correlation? Does economic growth really make us happy? These are such important questions. And to give you a little example of why of course it's not that simple, right? You could tell me, and I'm sure many of you are thinking it right now, economic growth won't make me happy if it's all going to just the richest in society. Economic growth, which is, you know, all being captured by just, you know, Jeff Bezos and his friends, and my income isn't growing, then of course it's not making everyone happier. Maybe it's just making a few people happier, right? So growth only raises happiness if it's shared, or everyone's happiness if it's being shared. And so this is some data from the UK to illustrate just how important inequality is in the current world, and sadly, you know, how much it's been rising. In the left panel, we have men, in the right panel, we have women, and they're split apart because women were entering the workforce a lot in this period. So the behavior of the two groups is quite different. This is a very interesting thing on itself, right? The rise of women in the workplace. If we focus on men who are already in the workplace at the beginning of this sample, right? The bottom line here that says 10th, this is the wages of the 10th poorest section of society. Okay, so this would be the wage of the 10% lowest group of wage earners. And then this is indexed on a scale here. So that what this is telling us is that over the last 40 years, the 10% poorest group of society has seen their wages grow by at most 10%, but then a lot of that's gone away after the financial crisis. So actually, if you focus on the 10% poorest group of society, their wages have barely risen for the last 40 years. This is crazy, right? We live in a world where we're just told that growth is happening every year. We're getting richer and richer. We're getting iPhones. We're getting, you know, better cars and all sorts, you know, nicer computers, thinner TVs. Growth, growth, growth. And the bottom 10% of society, their wages have barely increased over the last 40 years. That really puts you in context that growth is not everything, right? Growth doesn't necessarily affect the average person. Maybe that growth is going somewhere else. You can see this here, the 90th percent. So this is the 10% richest members of society. Their wages have grown by nearly 90%, around 75% in total over that same period. So over that last 40 years in the UK, where we've had sustained economic growth every year, the bottom 10% have captured very little of that growth, and the top 10% have captured quite a lot of it. Right? So inequality is important, and growth doesn't automatically drag people out of poverty. It doesn't automatically increase happiness, only if it's shared. Right? And it doesn't always seem to be shared. You can ask yourself, is this fair? That's a question you have to give yourself the answer to. All right, so I've got a couple of minutes left. So yeah, please tell me to stop if I run over too much, but I think I've got another about 3 minutes I'll go on for. Okay, and I want to talk to you about the macroeconomics of coronavirus. Because the coronavirus, obviously, it's a medical issue, it's a medical disease, but with many economic consequences, especially since so many of us are staying at home, not going to the cinema, and not buying things and so on. Okay, so it begs many economic questions. I'll start at the bottom because I'm going to end on the first one. Is this going to change the economy forever? God, what a question. Are we never going to go to the cinema ever again because we're all terrified of sitting too close to people? You know, maybe. That's the thing, something you need to work out. How are people's consumption habits going to change when this is all over? Will we start going back to the cinema? Will we start going back to the pub and to the restaurant? Next one. How do we protect jobs so that people can return to work when this is over? You know, now let's say that we're locked down for a few months. You know, let's hope just a few months. How do we protect jobs so that when this is over, people can go back to their original employer, right? And hopefully that employer will still be there and that job will still be there so that we can just kind of pick up where we left off. And the one that I want to talk about here, because I think it's a bit contentious and so important to think about properly, do we have to trade off saving lives versus losing GDP and jobs? So this is, this sort of lives versus GDP trade-off is how the government-enforced lockdown debate is framed. And it makes for quite unpleasant thinking, doesn't it? We don't really want to think like this. You don't want to think that we have to either let people die or save people's jobs, okay? And what I want to talk about today is that simple and unpleasant arithmetic may not actually even be true, okay? Because there's actually evidence that helping save lives is also helping to protect the economy. Okay, so the way that this debate is framed is typically, you know, if you do a lockdown, so the government forces people to stay home, like it's currently happening in the UK, then you're going to save lives, but firms are going to have to close and people are going to lose their jobs because no one is out in the shops buying things. Whereas if the government just took their hands off and said, you know what, do what you want, then there'd be more deaths as the virus spread, but there'd be no job losses because people would be able to go shopping and so on, right? It sounds sensible, but is it even true? Okay, it turns out it's nowhere near that simple, of course, right? That's why I'm talking to you about it. So this is some data showing that people stopped going to restaurants even before the government lockdown started. So this is data from the US, from OpenTable, which is a restaurant booking website. And what researchers did with this data, so they showed that people stopped going to restaurants 2 weeks before the lockdown even happened, just because people didn't want to go to restaurants right now because it was unpleasant to be around people and you don't want to get sick. You don't want to potentially spread the virus. If you're feeling guilty, you don't want to spread it around in case you hurt other people, right? And so this is what you can see in this line here. So 10 days before the virus kicks in, we're already down about 20%. By 5 days, 50% less people are going to restaurants. The day before the lockdown started, 75% less restaurant bookings than normal, okay? Because people voluntarily weren't going out because they didn't want to get sick or they didn't want to spread the virus. And what this lesson tells us is the virus directly causes economic costs on its own. It's not just the government shutting down the economy that hurts the economy, right? People choose not to go out, choose not to spend because of the virus, because they don't want to get sick and they don't want to spread the virus, okay? So that's a very different narrative from the idea that the government is the one that's causing the costs with the lockdown. But of course, if the government does a lockdown, it's going to hurt the economy more, right? You can't deny that at the moment that the government is telling us to stay home, that's going to push down economic activity even more, right? That I think is relatively common sense. But what about if we take the whole costs, the whole, not just today when we're being locked down, but next year, right? The next couple of months. Because it turns out that in a similar situation back in 1918, if the government did a stronger lockdown, it actually helped the economy overall, okay? And the reason is that yes, doing a lockdown hurts the economy even more while you're being locked down, but it also helps you defeat the virus quicker. And once the virus is defeated, right, people start going back to restaurants again, right? And in that case, the economy is going to be better, right, over the next, once the lockdown is actually removed, okay? So you can't just think about lockdown making things worse. You've got to think about, as well, lockdown making things better a couple of months down the line, okay? So this is some data from the US during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which was a horrible, horrible pandemic, which killed millions of people. This graph plots different cities in the US, shows their mortalities, the number of people who died during the pandemic versus the change in employment. So whether the economy created more jobs or lost jobs. And in green, the green dots are cities which did stricter lockdowns, and the red dots are cities that did less strict lockdowns. And what these researchers found is that the cities that did more strict lockdowns, they tend to be on this top left part of the graph, where they had less mortality and a higher change in employment, so more employment. So actually, doing the lockdown seems to have both helped reduce the amount of deaths, which is kind of intuitive, and also help the economy at the same time. And the reason being that defeating the virus earlier led to a rebound in the economy, right? Once the virus is gone and people were feeling safe to go out and consume again, okay? So as with many macroeconomic questions, the answer to this lives versus GDP trade-off is more complicated than it originally seems, right? But that's why it's interesting, and that's why so much of macroeconomics, at least to me, I find very, very interesting, right? Answers to difficult questions, so it can be a little bit messy, but they're important questions, and if we can get an answer, we can use that answer to hopefully make the world a little bit of a better place. Okay, so I've got a couple of links for further reading here, so if you download the slides, you can have a look at some links, which are basically where I got some of this information for the presentation, if you want to read a bit more. And so that just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening to the presentation. Thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure to share some of this with you. If you haven't applied to study with us at Essex yet and you'd like more information, or you'd like reminders about the upcoming webinars, then please go to this link here to sign up. Okay, so I wish you all the best. Hope you're all staying safe and happy. My name is Alex Climo, as said on the presentation. So please do feel free to get in touch with me if you'd like to talk to me personally, or to the team if you have any questions. Right? So thanks very much.